Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me today of hosting our first meeting, our first interview organized by the European Association of the Israeli Studies. Our first interview will be held with Professor Colin Shindler. I don't have to really introduce Professor Schindler to anyone from our association. Professor Schindler is a founder of the European Association of Israeli Studies. It's been over 10 years since the association met for the first time. Colin Shindler is an emeritus professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He became the first professor of Israeli studies in the UK in 2008, and he was a founding chairman of the European Association of the Israeli Studies in 2009. He is an author of 10 books, including the history of the modern Israel. His main interests lie in the evolution of the Israeli right, the changes in the approach of British and European left towards Israel since 1948, and the emigration movement of Soviet Jews between 1917 and 1991. He's also an author of extremely important book, Israel and European Left, Between Solidarity and Delegitimization. That was one of the first books to examine the history of the relationship between British left and Israel. He's currently honorary president of the European Association of the Israeli Studies. Professor Schindler, I would like to welcome you very warmly today in this morning.
That's very kind of you. After such a long introduction, I do feel I should dive under the table. I think when it gets past the second sentence, thank you. It's very nice of you. I mean, this is the first time in my life I've been an honorary president, and I don't really think of myself as in an honorary sense, or indeed in a presidential sense. But it's wonderful that the European Association of Israel Studies is continuing, and that more and more people are involved, and that people feel that the study of Israel, regardless of your views about the Israel-Palestine conflict, or indeed about Zionism, the study of Israel is something interesting and indeed can be fascinating, and it is also intellectually stimulating. So I'm delighted to be your first guest, so to speak.
Professor Schindler, of course, you're jumping ahead because that's going to be my first question that I'm going to ask you. You've been teaching actually Israeli studies for the last 20 years, 30 years actually. How would you evaluate actually the progress, or maybe actually the regress, in terms of this field of science?
Well, I think that, as I said just now, that I think Israel is a very interesting subject to teach. When I taught the Israel-Palestine conflict at SOAS, first time I taught it, I walked into the classroom and I found it was packed. And I don't put this down to my magnetic teaching abilities, but I think it's a fascinating subject. The Israel-Palestine conflict is, of course, very controversial, but it's not black or white, it's not simplistic, it's complex. And therefore, I think young people are particularly interested. I think also that they get fed up with the megaphone war, people shouting at each other, and they want to try and understand the reality. They want to understand the facts. Now, one can teach this subject. Of course, you have your own personal views. I think it's important to create a distance between striving for objectivity in teaching and your personal views. At the end of the day, the student will make up his or her mind over the veracity of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and hopefully they will have been informed, they will have been instructed. I don't believe in Hebrew it's known as hasbara. I think the problem, when I first became involved, when the whole thing started, the European Association of Israel Studies, is that on the one hand, you have people who saw this as merely an instrument for hasbara, for
promotion, basically.
Almost propaganda. On the other side, you had people mainly from the BDS, the boycott, disinvestment, sanctions type of people, who saw any teaching about Israel and Zionism as part of a conspiratorial plot. It wasn't like that. I strove when I was the chair of the European Association not to be political. I have my own views. I have political views, but I would only voice them outside of the confines of the European Association. And if I would sign a letter or if I would write an article, I would never sign it on behalf of as the chair of the European Association of Israel Studies. I always made that clear. So I think Israel Studies is, it's not an invented subject. It's really advanced tremendously during the last 10 years. It's remarkable.
So actually, this is a very interesting moment right now that we have, that Israel and the moderate Arab states are just about to sign the agreement. Actually, it happened 3 weeks ago that actually Israel, Bahrain, and the Emirates actually they for the first time met and they really agreed on a certain things. So it's also kind of a very changing moment. Do you think actually it's going to have any impact on the science, on the subject of the Israeli studies?
Yes, I do actually. Let me tell you a personal story which I kept quiet for many years. Must be 15 or more years ago. I'd set up a master's in an MA in Israel Studies at SOAS, and I would get people taking it. And I had one young woman, Lana Nusseibeh. Lana Nusseibeh came from a very well-known Palestinian family. Her grandfather Anwar was the Jordanian ambassador to the UK and led the excuse me, the Jordanian option as opposed to Arafat's PLO on the West Bank after '67. Her uncle was Sari Nusseibeh, who was part of the Palestinian peace camp. Her father went to the Gulf after '67 and became involved in building up the UAE. She took the MA and wrote brilliant essays. Some of the best essays I've read about Jabotinsky came from Lana Nusseibeh. And I didn't hear from her for many years. And she suddenly became the UAE's ambassador at the United Nations. And she has been involved in more recent times with the development of UAE-Israel relations. So I suppose what I'm saying is that, someone will take away your words and you don't know where they will go to, where they will reach. So Lana at the UN has been part of this mechanism. She studied Israel because she wanted to understand. And that's a prime example of people who are interested in Israel. Now, the recent agreement, I think, in one sense, it makes public what has been going on in a subterranean sense for many years. But I think that it will help to develop Israel studies openly in the Arab world. I'm hoping that Bahrain and the UAE, that there will be representatives at the European Association of Israel Studies. I think last year in Prague, we had someone from Egypt. So I'm really hoping this will develop. There's no reason why people from the Gulf states, from the Arab world, should not participate in the European Association of Israel Studies.
And if I can just follow up, 6 days ago, actually, by the way, there was even actually something more remarkable. I mean, there was a common commemoration, because actually there was an Arab delegation and the Israeli delegation in Berlin, and they were honoring actually the victims of the Holocaust. Yes. I think actually for the first time in the history that, we can in a way actually see the change, not only in the current politics, but also in a way actually in the historical narrative that was so far, well, very specific when it comes to the especially Shoah, Holocaust.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. I mean, I think in the past, the PLO used the Shoah to some extent. I'm not saying completely, but to some extent, it was a propaganda tool. And I think now, when there's a certain normalization between Israelis and the Arab world, you know, one can recognize, and this goes for both sides, the injustices that have been done on both sides, and in particular the recognition of the catastrophe, the tragedy that was the Shoah.
Let me just ask you actually this question, another question that is, in the last couple of years, we can really observe that actually the increasing anti-Semitism in Europe. What is the actually, I would say, a direction for European countries when it comes to their own Jewish communities?
I think the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe has indeed worried and indeed frightened many Jewish communities, particularly in Western Europe. For Jews, you know, all Jews are survivors. You know, my mother used to tell me when I was a little boy that if it wasn't for the 20 miles of clear blue water, that is the English Channel, you know, the Nazis would have been in Britain, and you know, the situation would have been the same as in the rest of mainland Europe. So that's my own personal memory. I think the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe in more recent times is that the further we are away from 1945, from the revelations of 1945, from understanding, you know, the reality of Auschwitz, that people have other agendas. The younger generation in Britain, I can say, and probably in other countries in Western Europe, their interest is mainly dealing with decolonization, and therefore they relate more to the Palestinians than to the Israelis, whereas Jews would relate to Israel. They may be severely critical of the Israeli government. For example, in several surveys that have been done in Britain, 75% of British Jews oppose the settlement drive. So I doubt very much if Jews in Britain had the vote, they would vote for Netanyahu. So there is a difference between expressing solidarity with Israel and solidarity with the Israel government. However, despite that, the advent of the social media has an ignorance about Jewish history and the distance from 1945 has meant that people who would attack Zionism, anti-Zionism, often in pure ignorance, it tips over into anti-Semitism. They use traditional anti-Semitic tropes and they don't really understand. So I think these have all been facets, these have all been symptoms of developing racism. And unfortunately, this has also affected the far left, that their emphasis on colonialism, on the Israel-Palestine conflict, has produced quite often an ignorance about Zionism. You know, is Zionism wrong or is it just different? It's also a problem of fitting it into theory, and Zionism doesn't fit into traditional theory for many people, and that's aside from the settlement expansion. That's aside from supporting Netanyahu. These views began to exist before 1967.
So it's also, let me just follow this. Actually, it's also very interesting. Actually, the communities, the Jewish communities are shrinking in Europe. Even actually in Great Britain, I think it's, as far as I remember, actually before the World War II, there were like 375,000 Jews living in Britain. Right now, it's 100,000 less. So it's not growing; it's really shrinking. At the same time, we have a skepticism, at least skepticism towards actually the Israeli government. So, what is the future actually for the Jewish community? Well, in France, at the same time, you have a massive, a large, the process of the large emigration to Israel. So, what is the future actually in your eyes, actually for the Jewish communities in the old continent?
I think they will continue, and I think it will expand. That may sound optimistic. I think in England, I think the figures, I seem to remember about 50 years ago, the number of Jews in Britain was 450,000. And now it's supposed to be 250 to 300,000. Well, of course, people emigrate, they leave for Israel, they leave for Australia, they leave for the States. And I think a lot of people assimilate or acculturate. Some people don't want to be known as Jews. They drop out. So there's all these factors. I'm always encouraged by the fact that there are lots of young Jews. I mean, I can only speak for Britain, but there are lots of young Jews who become very interested in their Jewishness. That can mean Judaism, it can mean Jewish history, Jewish literature, Hebrew literature, Yiddish. For example, there's the Limud Festival, which has been going since 1980. My wife and I, and when we had babies then, we went to the first Limud in 1980. There were maybe 50, 100 people there. Now it's all over the world. This came out of all places, England. So I do, when I do go back to Limud occasionally, I'm tremendously encouraged to see young people becoming involved in whichever area. So my sense is that although the numbers of Jews in Western Europe is relatively small, and there is an indeed ongoing Jewish emigration, particularly from France, as you mentioned, there's still a stable, intelligent, vibrant Jewish community in each place, and I don't think they're going to disappear.
Okay, but if I may, talking about Britain, we have very specific situation today. We have a mixture of a Brexit, of Boris Johnson, increasing anti-Semitism, actually from both sides of the political spectrum, by the way. How does it actually relate to Israel, in your eyes?
Well, it's very interesting. Boris Johnson, I don't know if there are any surveys, but I would have imagined that most Jews would not have supported Brexit. As an international people, they probably would have preferred to remain in Europe. I don't know. That's my supposition. Boris Johnson has always been a supporter of Israel. Indeed, the right in general now supports Israel. But interestingly enough, when Netanyahu was going to propose annexing part of the West Bank, this was, I think, in July, Boris Johnson wrote a long article supporting Israel but opposing Netanyahu. I think it was in Yediot, in one of the Hebrew language newspapers. So they make this distinction. So I think the right in general, whether it's indeed Poland or Hungary, populist leaders are very friendly with Netanyahu. And they see Israel, the Likud-led Israel, as part of this club that they all belong to. Indeed, Trump, of course, has fallen over himself regarding Israel. yet 70% of 75% of American Jews have always voted Democrat and probably will do so in the coming election. The antagonism towards Israel is from the far left. In Britain, for example, people were very worried that Jeremy Corbyn would become prime minister, and indeed there were, some people said, if that happens, I'm leaving. So there was that worry. Corbyn was a prime example of many people who are trapped in the far left bubble. They can't think outside the borders, often very ignorant about Jewish history, and they see the Israel-Palestine conflict in one-dimensional terms. The charge against Corbyn is not that he is a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Semite who has read Mein Kampf and all the rest of it, but that he was someone who presided over meetings throughout his life, chairing panels, being on panels, and when people would make anti-Semitic comments, he would remain silent. And that's the difference. And in a funny way, there's a parallel with Trump. Charlottesville in 2017, terrible things happened there. And there was a torchlit procession of young men chanting, "Jews will not replace us," meaning that Jews were the fifth column who were dangling the strings of influence in replacing whites by blacks and Hispanics and whatever. And Trump was very ambivalent. He said, "Oh, there were terrible people on both sides." So, this is the sort of equivocal attitude that people take. And if racism occurs, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic feeling, anti-black feeling, you call it out, you condemn it. And leaders such as Corbyn and Trump didn't do that.
And that's also, I remember actually a situation where when Corbyn was accused of going to the funeral, of the anniversary of the funeral of somebody, one of the attackers from the Munich attack in the 70s. And it was like literally people accused him of being like, how can you go actually to honor such a man who really did such a crime? So it's not only actually the ignorance when it comes to the not presenting actually the proper wording or expressions when it comes to the anti-Semitic speeches. It's also a bit more like an active attitude in a way. I mean, this is what he was accused of actually by some people.
Yes, I remember that. I think he was very superficial. I think it was Abu Iyad actually who he was placing flowers on the grave. I think he is very superficial. I don't think he has a real knowledge of the Palestinian struggle. I think he has. He's always said he's a man of peace, a man who wanted to see peace in the Middle East, but he's never been a mediator between Israelis and Palestinians, between peace-loving people on both sides. He's never been a mediator. He's been only a propagandist for one side only. So, that's how I understand Jeremy Corbyn.
So let me just jump into another actually related question. Actually, what is the thin line between the anti-Semitism and the criticism of Israel? I mean, you've been teaching actually Israeli studies for so many years, and you as a scholar, you're in a way actually obliged actually to take up the challenge, actually to criticize, to have a critical thinking when it comes to the many different fields, especially that is quite controversial. How can you cope with that in a way? I mean,
well, I think that I think if you take the far right in Israel, they will always say that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitic. If you take the far left in Britain, they will say that anti-Zionism can never be anti-Semitic. And the reality is, when these occurrences occur, they're often at some point along that spectrum. Anti-Zionism was held strongly, a view held strongly by Jews, communist Jews in the 1920s. They strongly opposed Zionism. The Bund, Jewish Socialist Bund, strongly opposed Zionism. And you could argue possibly that it was only after the Shoah, after 1945, that the majority of Jews began to understand the need for a Hebrew Republic in the land of Israel. So on one level, there is a certain legitimacy in having a debate about Zionism. It's another thing when Zionism is used as a label for Jew, when you want to talk about the Zionist lobby, you know, meaning British Jews. So I think that there is a difference between talking about Zionism and anti-Semitism, if you like, within the classroom, within intellectual circles, with people who have a knowledge of history, and the general sense in the outside world where people don't have that knowledge, where things are banded around. It's where anti-Zionism tips over into anti-Semitism easily.
Mm-hmm.
It does it less so within the classroom. And I think the objectivity of any teacher is to try and construct a conversation, a rational, non-racist, objective conversation in the classroom. It's people, at the end of the day, students are not stupid. They make up their own minds. I have my own views on this very clearly, as you probably can guess. But you know, the worst thing to do is to say this is right and that is wrong. This is black and that is white. You have to allow students to come to their own conclusion.
But I have a feeling actually the last couple of years, there are more and more people willing to challenge even actually the definition of anti-Semitism. That, you know, some people were saying that, you know, actually being anti-Zionist is sometimes legitimate, is sometimes actually the same as being anti-Semitic. And by this simplification in many respects, people are not afraid so much to be anti-Semitic. So people are more and more open to say, I'm anti-Israel, I'm basically also anti-Semitic, and I have no problem with that. Is that something, I mean, well, for me, it's extremely dangerous situation.
Sure, I think there is a great danger about this. I think in England, in particular, there was a reaction from the Jewish community, from young Jews in particular, against the Corbynistas' attitude towards Zionism. Their slogan was "Enough is enough," and everything. You know, the debate was conducted in the public domain, and that was right. That they should challenge it. And you know, we spoke before about young Jews standing up. You know, announcing their Jewishness, and that young Jews in Britain stood up for themselves. And I think that was admirable and something I respected. I think that's a slight. There's a different debate to be held in the classroom, which is informed by history, which is informed by many other factors. I do believe this. I think that the IHRA definition of, you know, anti-Semitism is something for the public domain, undoubtedly, but a lot of people in universities have kept their distance from it. because they feared it's going to stifle academic debate. That's certainly an argument to be had. So I think there are these two areas which are different.
Pastor Schindler, I apologize actually for talking politics for a moment, but 3 weeks ago we had a agreement that is actually practically actually the start of the many series of different agreements actually between moderate Arab states and Israel. In the White House 3 weeks ago, there was literally nobody from the European politicians. I think there are only representatives of Hungary that were invited, no one else. How can we interpret that? I mean, well, is Europe losing the position when it comes to the Middle East?
I think there's always been a difference between Europe and the United States in terms of their attitude towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. Both, there are historical parallels. Israel and America fought the same colonizer, the British, 1776, 1948. So there are certain parallels there. There's a huge Jewish community in the United States which identifies with Israel. In one sense, both Israel and America house the survivors of the Shoah. So there are parallels there. In Europe, in Western Europe, the relationship with Jews and indeed with Zionism has been much more ambiguous. Europe, Poland is the graveyard of European Jewry. This is where it all happened. In addition, the West Europeans have a legacy of colonialism. The British Empire, the French Empire, King Leopold of the Belgians killed millions of people in the Congo a century and a half ago. And in one sense, the Israel-Palestine conflict comes into this. And I think now in England, I think it's Black History Month. There's a lot of programs on television about Black history and about slavery, and quite rightly. But the legacy of that is that they include Israel in that scene. Israel is seen as white rather than as Jewish. And I think that's wrong. And I think that's due to people's ignorance that you can only see things in one dimension. So, I think in one sense, this is, if you take a course on Israel studies, you show it's complex. It's not as simplistic as people think. And I know, I used to teach, as I said at the beginning, Israel-Palestine conflict. And when it was usually 20 lectures, 10 lectures in the first term up to Christmas, 10 lectures up to Easter in the spring. And when they started, they would come out with these slogans and cliches. But by the end of the 2 terms, the 20 lectures, they would understand that it was far more complex. They would be informed. They would indeed be educated. One of the first things I would tell my students is that you don't have to accept what I say, but you have to educate yourselves. You have to make an effort to read and to educate yourselves as to the complexity of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that always worked. That always worked. I never had any problems. I used to have huge classes of people that came from all areas of life. Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, Israelis, everyone. And I never had any real problems.
Going back for a moment actually to our European problems, to European politicians and European politics. We have on one hand, we have Trump, who is not really actually looking in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli relations. Trump basically is jumping in the Middle East, taking the situation as it is, conquer and rule in a way. Europe is seeing actually the politics and its own policy from the perspective of 20, 30, 40 years. But at the same time, Trump is more flexible. Europe remained strongly dedicated actually to the Palestinian state and the borders of 1967. Should that be changed anyhow, modify, or we should as Europeans stick to the borders from 1967, to the green line of 1967? What is your, assessment of the European politics when it comes to the conflict?
Well, I think that the Europeans will reflect the position of the peace camps in both Israel and Palestine, in that the 1967 borders are not fixed, that there has to be certain flexibility. In all negotiations, we know this about Brexit now, and is there going to be a deal? This is what I was listening to on the radio this morning. People start out with their positions, and once you get into the negotiating room, things begin to change. I can see, I think on your bookshelf there, you've got Dennis Ross's book, The Missing Piece. Well, if you read that book, you see that the Israelis and Palestinians come into the negotiating room, and they're prepared not to give an inch, and they suddenly have to confront reality. If there is to be peace in the Middle East, if there's to be peace for both peoples, you have to compromise. That's the nature of any negotiations. That's the outcome of any negotiations. And with regard to the 67 borders being hard and fixed, I think you see, for example, the Clinton parameters of 20 years ago are different, and and Annapolis and many other plans that have really not got off the ground suggests that there is this flexibility.
And by the way, if we actually take that book of Dennis Ross, we can address the whole chapter that is actually extremely important about the Camp David conference. And when we talk about a flexibility, you can really read, how unflexible, there is a lack of flexibility actually from the Palestinian side when it comes to 1967 borders. So that's the problem what I'm asking. Actually, the whole world is seeing actually there's a need for a change when it comes to the West Bank, Gaza Strip territory. Well, American delegation offered in January of this year, before this accord, they offered 70% of the West Bank, and Europe still seems to be glued actually to this to the green line of 1967, along with the Palestinians. So that's also my question. We can observe in the last 20 years, 15 years, the European dedication to the Palestinian case without any criticism on the Palestinian leadership. Is this something what should we change or stick to this?
Of course it should be changed, but it will change, because I think these are opening positions. The Europeans have this stated position, but I think the reality is that they will change. They will recognize any compromise. At the end of the day, the Europeans will recognize any agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. They're not going to say the Palestinians didn't do well enough. They'll come out and agree with it. If you go to the United States, it's interesting that for several years, the Trump administration, David Friedman, Jason Greenblatt, Jared Kushner, they're all trumpeting this great plan about the Trump peace plan, and how they were going to that Israel would be allowed to annex part of the West Bank, actually, which brought opposition from settlers in many isolated areas because they wouldn't be included within the Israeli borders. And we heard April, May, that David Friedman was working hard to do the borders, to work out what the actual borders were. And then all of a sudden, we get the UAE-Israel agreement that they would set up diplomatic relations if there was no annexation. Not a word has been heard from David Friedman. I mean, he's devoted 3 or 4 years of his life, because that's his ideological approach, to securing the annexation of part of the West Bank. You know, so the price that Friedman and all the others have paid in terms of the establishment of diplomatic relations with the UAE as to marginalize the Trump plan, as to push the whole idea of annexation on, you know, to the wall, so to speak. So you get these very interesting developments. Now, that's not something that the Europeans could have, you know, contemplated. You know, I think they're quite minor players in a strange way. It's the Americans and the Israelis and the Palestinians. Indeed, all the various peace agreements from Sadat and Begin and Carter to dealing with Barak and Arafat and Clinton, you know, all of this, and you know, you have one of the iconic images is the signing of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn with Peres and Rabin and Arafat and Clinton. You know, so you know, where are the Europeans in all of this?
In other words, actually, we remain on a position of the facilitator in a way, or just a sponsor of changing the reality of the Middle East, but not really a key player when it comes to the brokering actually peace on the Middle East. That's our position, and I don't think it will not change.
Oh.
Let me ask you actually one of the crucial questions I would like to ask you. That is. Can you see in your assessment, actually, in the political horizon on the Middle East, actually the Palestinian state in upcoming 20 or 30 years?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. It's a very good question. I think that if you had asked me that question 25 years ago or more, I would have said, yes, it would have been a consequence, an outcome of the negotiations between Rabin and Arafat, because it was moving in that direction. All these years later, I don't know. You have to differentiate between wishful thinking and the reality. I think that it may be possible if things change in Israel and in Palestine, if there's new leadership in both areas, if there is a sort of calming of relations between Israelis and Palestinians per se, if there's a more rational leadership in the White House, you know, that may well be possible. One thing I found very interesting is that there seem to be rumblings about some sort of federated state with Jordan. They're bringing back the
Jordanian option.
The Jordanian option. And I think the Palestinians are in a very weakened position at the moment. Mahmoud Abbas is well into his 80s. The Gulf Arab states, in particular, of course, the UAE and Bahrain, which have established relations, but all the Gulf Arab states are fed up with the Palestinians. They're fed up with the Palestinians. They're fed up with the Palestinian issue. You could argue, sure, they're distant from it. They're not frontline states. Okay, fair enough. But they're also fed up with it. And the frontline states of Egypt and Jordan have made peace with Israel. And even as we speak, there are discussions going on between the Lebanese and the Israelis. So the Palestinian issue is receding. It's not first and foremost in people's minds. So it may well be that you find a resurrection of this idea of some relationship with Jordan. You know, after all, you know, historically, why is the West Bank called the West Bank? It's because the East Bank of the Jordan is the state of Jordan. So, you know,
Everything is open then.
everything is open. So we'll have to see.
And the very last question before we conclude, also extremely hard and unpredictable question, I believe. I mean, what is the future for the Israeli right and for Benjamin Netanyahu? You were talking about actually the change within actually the Palestinian Israeli movements and the leadership. Can you see the horizon actually for the change in Israel?
Well, I think it clearly depends on what happens in the trial in January with Netanyahu. Will he be convicted? Will he be acquitted? Will he have to step down? And if he does step down, who will take over? Will it be Naftali Bennett? Apparently, I think I was looking at the opinion polls, Naftali Bennett's party, Yamina, is doing very well. So I think the greater question is, will there be a drift from the far right and center right back to the center and to the left? That doesn't look as if it's on the horizon at the moment. And I think it's really dependent on the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. So if I say, if there is a new leadership in both camps, and if there is a sense both within Israel and the Palestinian territories that the two sides can come together, then, you know, maybe this will move to make a movement in Israeli politics towards the center and to the right. I mean, the interesting thing about the Oslo Accords in 1993 was that this was a movement of the peace camps in both Israel and Palestine. It rejected their rejectionists. That doesn't exist today. Is there such a possibility that that could reoccur in the future? Maybe. But, you know, I'm not giving you a very clear answer to your question. It's speculation, sure. But, you know, you can see possibly the political constellation of the Middle East changing if certain factors are fulfilled, if certain things come to pass. So who knows?
And let's leave the situation like this, because truly, I mean, there's more question marks than answers actually these days on the Middle East. Just to mention that 2 days ago, I watched actually the interview with the Minister of the Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia about actually the accords that were signed 3 weeks ago. And well, he spoke a lot about many different things about the relations with the US. When it came to the questions of Israel and the Israeli Accords, I mean, he was like he spent like a minute talking about, you know, the possibilities, chances, nothing concrete. So I think actually the situation is so dynamic right now in the Middle East. It's changing from one day to another.
Sure. Yes. I think the only thing that you can predict about the Middle East, and particularly the Israel-Palestine conflict, is that it is unpredictable. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. And, you know, in a funny way, when people tell me, I mean, you know, I've been involved in this for over 50 years. People say, don't you get pessimistic? Don't you get depressed? Of course, everyone does. But because of the unpredictability, because you don't know what tomorrow morning is going to bring, you remain an optimist. You remain an optimist that peace will break out.
And by the way, actually, I was just trying to imagine and imagine the situation that we have a complex accords between Arab moderate states and Israel, and then you have this agenda actually brought to Europe and to your European universities, and those who are always very pessimistic, maybe not pessimistic, but even actually they were openly pro-Arabic, pro-Palestinian. They are losing, in a way, actually the legitimacy, actually the position of doing that, as long as you have suddenly actually a new agreements. That was actually extremely interesting when it comes to the science and the dynamics at the universities.
Yeah, well, it's injustice fuels student passions and an intellectual argument, and peace is to some extent quite boring. What can you say? But yeah, sure.
Professor Schindler, I would like to actually thank you for the great interview. I'm sure it's not the last time that actually we see each other online. Actually, on the conference, there's going to be a conference soon, I think, organized by the European Association of Israeli Studies, and I'm sure this time it will be fully online, because actually we are currently living in times where everything is done online. So I'm sure we're going to meet each other actually soon, and we're going to be seeing, ladies and gentlemen, also of course our audience as well.
Thank you very much for the interview, and I not only look forward to meeting you online, but hopefully meeting you in person at some point. So let's hope for the future.
Thank you.
Be well.